Welcome back to part 3 of this UBG Byte of Hacking Team and how a single hack in 2015 is still reshaping global surveillance policy, international law, and corporate accountability nearly a decade later. Over the past 2 episodes, we've explored how Hacking Team built a surveillance empire and how Phineas Fisher brought it crashing down with 100 hours of brilliant hacking. Today, we're diving into why that breach represents one of the most consequential cybersecurity incidents in modern history. Not because of the immediate damage, but because of the systemic changes it triggered worldwide. We're concluding our analysis using the same leaked documents, policy research, and regulatory changes that followed the breach. If you want to understand how individual cyber operations can create lasting geopolitical change, this is the case study that explains how it actually works. Because here's what makes this story so significant. The Hacking Team breach didn't just destroy one company. It fundamentally altered how governments regulate surveillance technology exports, how human rights organizations track digital oppression, and how the entire commercial surveillance industry operates. Let's start with the immediate aftermath. Within weeks of the breach, Hacking Team's business model was completely destroyed. The exposed source code made their flagship RCS software easily detectable by security tools. Customers couldn't use compromised technology that security researchers could now identify and block. But the damage went far beyond one company. The breach exposed the entire ecosystem of commercial surveillance technology, revealing how companies like Hacking Team enabled government oppression while maintaining plausible deniability. Competitors like NSO Group and Finn Fisher suddenly found themselves under intense scrutiny as researchers and activists used the leaked documents to understand how the industry really operated. The security community's response was swift and unforgiving. Privacy International's Eric King stated, "Surveillance companies like Hacking Team have shown they are incapable of responsibly regulating themselves, putting profit over ethics time after time." The breach accelerated industry consolidation as smaller surveillance companies struggled with increased scrutiny and regulatory oversight. What's fascinating from a strategic perspective is how the breach changed competitive dynamics. Companies with better operational security and more ethical business practices gained market advantage, while companies with similar vulnerabilities to Hacking Team faced existential threats. The breach essentially created a natural selection pressure that favored more responsible surveillance companies. The most lasting impact came from the regulatory changes the breach triggered worldwide. The 2016 to 2017 updates to the Wassenaar Arrangement, the international export control regime for dual-use technologies, directly referenced Hacking Team-style abuses in refined definitions of intrusion software and strengthened human rights considerations in export licensing. The European Union's response was particularly comprehensive. The 2021 EU dual-use export regulation significantly enhanced controls with mandatory human rights due diligence requirements and enhanced consideration of repressive regime and use. These weren't minor administrative changes. They fundamentally altered how surveillance technology could be exported and to whom. Italy revoked Hacking Team's global export license in 2016, requiring individual permissions for each sale. Multiple countries added surveillance technologies to national control lists, while the U.S. Commerce Department created new interim rules on cybersecurity items and eventually placed NSO Group and other surveillance companies on the Entity List. Over 40 countries strengthened surveillance export controls post-breach, with the EU reporting a 30% increase in surveillance export license denials between 2015 and 2017. The global surveillance industry was estimated to have lost 15 to 20% of its market value as regulatory compliance costs increased and market access became more restricted. But here's what's really significant about these regulatory changes. They were directly informed by the leaked Hacking Team documents. Policymakers could see exactly how surveillance companies circumvented existing controls, used middlemen to reach prohibited customers, and prioritized profits over human rights. The breach provided the evidence base needed for effective regulation. Perhaps the most lasting impact was the transparency the breach provided into government surveillance operations. For the first time, human rights researchers had comprehensive documentation of how surveillance technology was actually being used worldwide. The leaked documents revealed evidence of spying on Ethiopian journalists in the United States, targeting of human rights activists in Morocco and the UAE, and surveillance operations against civil society organizations across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Bill Marchak from Citizen Lab noted that internal company reactions showed their primary concern seemed to have been not getting caught again, highlighting their awareness of human rights violations. These revelations sparked new academic research programs focused on tracking surveillance technology deployment. Universities developed methodologies for identifying surveillance infrastructure and monitoring its use against civil society. The breach essentially created an entire new field of digital rights research. Human rights organizations used the revelations to push for stronger regulations and international accountability mechanisms. The Coalition Against Unlawful Surveillance Exports formed specifically to advocate for better controls on surveillance technology exports. Multiple UN special rapporteurs incorporated breach findings into surveillance technology reports, legitimizing concerns about commercial surveillance abuses. The 2023 Summit for Democracy initiative saw 25 countries endorse a code of conduct on surveillance export controls with direct references to preventing hacking team-style abuses. International law discussions emerged around commercial surveillance accountability, with some scholars arguing for individual criminal liability for surveillance company executives who enable human rights violations. Meanwhile, Hacking Team itself was completely destroyed. Revenue plummeted from 40 million euros annually as customers abandoned compromised technology. Staff levels reduced dramatically as projects were canceled and the company faced intense regulatory scrutiny. The toxic corporate culture that we explored in episode 1 became even more exposed through leaked internal communications. Employee retention became impossible as the company's reputation made it difficult to hire, and existing staff faced professional consequences for their association with the company. David Vincenzi's personal downfall was particularly dramatic. By 2020, he posted on LinkedIn, "Hacking Team is dead," a bizarre obituary for his own company. Reports emerged in 2023 of his arrest in Milan for allegedly stabbing his wife's caretaker with mental health concerns raised during legal proceedings. It was a tragic end for surveillance capitalism's most notorious figure. In April 2019, IM, the cyber group led by Paolo Lezzi, acquired the remnants of Hacking Team for an undisclosed sum, creating Memento Labs with the slogan, "Hunting in the Dark." Despite rebranding efforts and claims of focusing only on legitimate law enforcement uses, the new company struggled with ongoing reputational challenges, mass employee departures, and difficulty competing against companies without the Hacking Team legacy. Research organizations continue tracking post-breach developments, with ESET detecting new RCS variants in 2018-2019, suggesting continued development. Evidence indicates ongoing use in 14 countries despite the source code leak, with digital certificates showing continued development by original Hacking Team personnel under the Memento Labs banner. But the new company never achieved anything close to the original's market position. The breach had fundamentally altered the industry landscape in ways that made Hacking Team-style operations much more difficult and risky. Despite extensive investigation by Italian prosecutors lasting over 2 years, Phineas Fisher was never identified or prosecuted. The case was ultimately shelved in late 2017 due to lack of cooperation from U.S. authorities, with one magistrate noting that American refusal to share, quote, potentially vital information hindered the probe. But Phineas Fisher's impact extended far beyond the immediate hack. The detailed DIY guide published in 2016 became a blueprint for subsequent hacktivist operations against surveillance companies. The demonstration that 100 hours of work by one person can undo years of a multi-million-dollar company's work inspired similar operations while forcing the industry to dramatically improve its own cybersecurity practices. Several subsequent breaches of surveillance companies used similar methodologies, suggesting that Phineas Fisher's techniques had been adopted by other hacktivists. The breach established a precedent that surveillance companies could be held accountable through extra-legal means when traditional oversight mechanisms failed. From a strategic perspective, Phineas Fisher succeeded in creating what military theorists call demonstration effects, showing other actors that similar operations were possible and providing them with the tools and techniques to carry them out. The hacking team breach fundamentally reframed public debates about surveillance technology governance. Before 2015, discussions about surveillance technology focused primarily on technical capabilities and law enforcement needs. After the breach, human rights implications became central to policy discussions. The breach provided concrete evidence for abstract concerns about surveillance technology misuse. Policymakers could no longer dismiss human rights advocates' warnings as theoretical when they had documented evidence of surveillance companies knowingly selling to repressive regimes and enabling human rights abuses. Current policy debates around